Today will be our second video on shop organization, and we're going to turn our attention to tool storage. To start, we're going to group them into 5 categories, and I'll go over how I store them and why. Those categories are large power tools, clamps, portable or handheld power tools, basic hand tools, and then accessories for those tools. So why do we go in that order? The main reason is how they're stored and size. When looking at large power tools, there's 3 things I took into consideration: space to work, proximity to power, and proximity to dust collection. So let's start off by looking at the heart of the shop, the table saw.
I put mine right in the middle of the garage depth-wise for a very specific reason. My garage is 22 feet deep. My table saw is right around 2 feet in depth. By putting it in the center, it gives me 10 feet on each side of the saw. Because I work a lot with plywood, which generally comes in 8x4 sheets, this allows me to stand behind the plywood to feed it into the saw, and there is plenty of room on the other side without having to move anything or open the garage door. Note that it is important when planning out your mobile tools you figure out not only where you plan to use them, but also where you plan to store them when they're not in use. In my case, I need to be able to pull both cars in during the winter, so for the table saw I have a functional space where I use the saw and a place that I move it to in order to store it when it's not in use. Because of this, I'm limited with what I can do with the space where the saw is stored. So for me, I chose to put an in-wall heater here to not completely waste the space when I'm actually using the saw. The next tool isn't very large itself, but it gets used a ton, and that's my miter saw. For years I cut items on the floor, so the footprint of this tool was very small, but is also very inconvenient. Eventually I made a fold-up wing cart. This was great as it was able to be stored away small when not in use, and took up minimal floor space. But when I wanted to use it, it was time-consuming to set up, it wasn't the most stable thing, it couldn't support long boards well, and over time became inaccurate as the wings sagged or the hinges bent. Because of this, I took the time to really figure out how I could have a more permanent solution. I really didn't think it was possible because of the small amount of space that I had. Originally, I built my flip-top workbench to be stored back in this cubby, so it took a bit of a mind shift to move that out of its original home and move it to make room for the new miter station.
And this is what I came up with. I was really happy that Why does it keep doing that?
I had planned on upgrading my miter saw at some point, and to make this work, I needed one with a lower profile. I also had to cut out the bottom to clear the foundation and the dust collection pipe. It is mobile, mainly for cleaning purposes or if I ever need to access the pipe, but because it leans up against the wall, it's still very sturdy. Having a solid bench that doesn't bend or come out of square and allows me to cut long boards and use a stop block, it makes using this tool faster and much more enjoyable. The other great thing about this bench is although I did trade some floor space for it for added functionality, I gained a ton of drawer space. This was one of the biggest steps in getting myself organized, as the things that don't easily hang on the wall now had a home.
The next tools I really wanted but didn't have the room in this shop for a full-size tool, and those are the tools that are encased in this workbench. Those tools are my joiner, my planer, my benchtop grinder, my belt sander, bandsaw, drill press, and oscillating sander. Again, I would love full-size tools of all of these, but because I use them less, it made sense if I wanted to have them at all to get smaller versions of them for now until I get a bigger shop someday. If you'd like to know more about this bench, here's a link above if you want to find out more of how I made it and how it works.
Next is the air compressor. This one started off under my workbench. This was great because it allowed me to tuck it away, the space above it was actually functional, and by adding sound dampening foam, it made it much quieter while in the shop. It then runs up the wall, across the ceiling, and down to a ceiling mounted reel that allows me to use it anywhere in the shop, and it's out of the way when I don't need it, and no more tripping over air hoses in the middle of a project. This year, however, I decided the 6-gallon was not enough, as it was constantly running and I wouldn't be able to use it for finishing, so I upgraded to a 27-gallon tank. This obviously wouldn't fit in the previous location, so instead I put it in the basement. I was able to run the line up the wall into the garage, clear into the attic, and then over to the ceiling reel. Now I have 4 times the capacity, I don't hear it all the time when I'm in the shop, and eventually I plan to fully insulate that room to help with the noise in the house. Someday. Last, we're going to talk about my dust collector. This one I had to get extremely creative to make work. It is far from ideal, but it gets the job done, and outside of when I'm planing or joining boards, it's not much of a drawback at all. My dust collector is actually under my workbench. I modified the factory separator into a 2-stage. This is based off an idea from April Wilkerson. I will link her video below that shows how she did this part in detail. This allows me to separate almost all the sawdust and chips prior to it getting to the motor. Because of this, I'm able to exhaust the air outside, which eliminates the need for a large filter, saving me a ton of space. Because it's under the bench, I'm able to block out a ton of the sound from it, again using the sound dampening foam. In fact, it's louder outside of the garage than inside. Sorry, neighbors. The only downside is the small size of the collection bin. It's only able to hold about 10 gallons, which is fine for sanding and cutting and most things I do around the shop, other than when I'm actually using the planer or joiner. The worst thing that happens if I don't catch it in time is it just shoots sawdust out the side of the house into a bush or on top of the mulch, which I may or may not have found out the hard way.
So that's it for the large power tools in my shop. Every single one of them are either mobile or they're tucked out of the way and take up little to no room in the actual shop itself. Next, we're going to turn our attention to clamps. The reason I recommend these over the other tools I haven't mentioned yet on location isn't importance, it's convenience.
One big mistake I made when I located my first clamp rack was I tucked it away so that it would be out of the way, as this seemed logical at the time. The problem I had was that when it came time to assemble, I had to walk across the room to grab the ones I needed, which is fine, but the problem was that I didn't take them back when I was done. Instead, the clamps would just lie around, likely be pushed around the bench, would end up on the floor or up against a wall, but they never got back to where they belonged. So when I built my second clamp rack, I put it as close as possible to the assembly table. Ever since then, when I'm done using a clamp, it takes me no time to actually put them away, so I find myself keeping them organized and clean most of the time. Another thing I did different with my second clamp rack is I put it on French cleats. This allowed for added flexibility, once again planning for growth. The thing I love the most about this setup is the larger clamps, I switched how I normally see them stored. My first one was stored long ways. It had a slot for each clamp. By changing this, it provides multiple benefits. First, you can fit more clamps in a smaller area. This is another huge call out to typically underutilized space. My scrap cart beneath sticks out 19 inches. My old clamp rack was designed off a pretty common style rack that only stuck out 5 inches. The one I currently have sticks out 10. The point is I will never utilize this airspace. Me keeping this rack closer to the wall does me absolutely no good as I can't stand any closer because of the cart below. So by extending the rack out, I'm able to store more clamps in otherwise underutilized space. If I had more clamps of the same type, I would have brought them out even further, but 8 clamps per size was enough for me. The old style clamp rack had a clamp every 1.5 inches, so for 8 clamps that would take up 12 inches. By using this orientation, I can fit 8 clamps in only 5 inches of wall space, and in theory I can fit 16 in that same amount of space. So one key point with this is that if you have something you're storing on the ground that isn't a workbench or a work surface for you, do whatever you can to utilize the airspace above it versus just the wall space. Save all your shallow tools or hardware to put over workbenches so you don't lose that surface space on the bench top. The second benefit of this clamp orientation is that if I need a lot of clamps, I can easily grab a bunch in each hand and go to the table quickly. The same holds true with putting them away. The old method I had to take them off and put them back on one at a time, which added to the inconvenience of actually putting them back when I was done. And the same is going to hold true as spring clamps. My old way I had to squeeze each one open to get them on or off, which isn't very efficient. When making my first clamp rack, I made the mistake of settling on what would be the most efficient to build and not what would be the most efficient to use. After using them for a few years, I knew there had to be a better way. So my second versions were a little more time consuming to make, but they make using the clamps and putting them away much quicker.
One thing to note on the clamps, you'll want to make a larger brace for them if you plan on bringing it out any further or to store heavier clamps like pipe clamps for instance. You want it to be tall enough to actually hit a second French cleat for added stability. Power hand tools are next. I wanted to get as many of these out as possible, so to do this a lot of these are mounted into the wall using French cleats. I hate pegboard. I hate it. I moved all my tools off of pegboards over to French cleats. In fact, I tore out all the pegboard in my shop and gave it to my neighbor, which was the least I could do after blowing sawdust out the side of my house in his yard.
To make French cleats, I simply rip a 3/4 inch plywood sheet into 5-inch sections. I then drop the blade to 45 degrees, set the fence to 2 1/16 inch or 2 1/8 inch depending on the curve of the saw blade. Then mount the cleats to the wall with the gap on top facing the wall, ensuring level along the way and hitting each stud that you can. This method allows so much customization in your shop as your tools grow. I chose to space mine further apart to save on wood, but you can space them closer together for more flexibility down the road. So I'll start off with the drills since I use them the most. I made my own holder for these. You can literally find 5,000 videos on how to make these on YouTube, so I won't waste your time with this other than 2 learnings. First, make more spaces than you think you need so you have room to grow. Nail guns also fit nicely in these holders. Second, don't just plan for how many drills you have, Plan for how many chargers you have or want to have so you can charge all the batteries easily for them as well. A lot of the chargers are wider than the drills themselves, and that can be sometimes an afterthought. Next is my battery-powered circular saw. I spent the time to make a specific holder for this saw, and I really like how it turned out, but I quickly realized how it was a lot of work for just one holder. If I ever upgraded or got a different saw, it would likely not fit in this holder and it would be a waste, so I decided to go a different route for the rest of my power tools. I made this long holder with separators that can be moved around to accommodate different tools. These are up out of the way and they're feature-proof. I plan on making another one to the left eventually as I need more space. I really love this setup for just how simple it is.
Next, let's go over basic hand tools. I mentioned earlier that I pulled out the pegboard and added French cleats. Well, for these, I took it a step further. And since 95% of my hand tools are made of metal, big shocker here, I used a ton of magnets. This is what I came up with.
For organizing, I tried to keep like tools together. I kept the ones that I use the most at the bottom for easy access. I also was a nice husband and basic tools my wife may need to use, primarily screwdrivers, were down at the bottom so she could easily get to them. Because these are grouped together and on French cleats, if I'm not sure what socket I need or what size wrench I need, I can quickly take the entire group of tools over to the project to go figure that out. Last, tool accessories. Like I said earlier, I do my best to keep most accessories close to the tool itself for efficiency, but for random one-offs, I use magnets whenever possible. For instance, these router bits came in a case. I peeled off the stickers from their container and used more magnets because I hated trying to get them out of the holder and hoping I didn't run my finger across the blade as I pulled them out. Plus, it was one more thing to pull out, sit down on a surface, and leave there to be later in the way. I also used magnet strips to organize jigsaw and reciprocating saw blades. For circular saw blades, I decided to make this holder. It allows me to have 6.5 inch, 7.25 inch, or 10 inch blades. The yellow box is my dado set. The wrench to change out my table saw is kept in this little section. And the charger for my circular saw is on top. Over in this far corner, I have my pocket hole jig and drill press table. They are clear over here because I only use them on this end of the bench. I mounted them over here because I found myself walking across the shop to bring them back over here each time, and then take them back over after I was done using them.
That's going to do it for tool storage. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Small shops have a lot of imperfections, and a lot of times we have to store stuff in a less than ideal way than if we had a larger shop. So my goal with this series is to help you think outside the box to make the most out of this space, so you can get more done and enjoy your space more. If you like what you saw or learned something new, feel free to like the video. If you want to see more content like this or the rest of this series, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you're notified when new videos get posted. The next video we'll cover is wood storage, and that will go over how I look at it and why I organize it the way that I do. It'll likely be a shorter video, but because of the footprint it takes up in the shop, it made sense to make that next. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.